Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode here on Swish City. I'm your host, Bruce Veliz, and in this episode, we're going to be diving in and exploring another team as we look at the NBA offseason breakdowns and dive into each individual team's season preview, gearing up for the 2025-2026 NBA season. If you've been subscribed or have been paying attention to this series, you would know there have been an abundance of teams that we've already talked about here on the channel. But if you want to make sure you stay up to date on everything, hit the subscribe button so you can see your team if they have not been discussed already. As you guys can tell from the thumbnail and from the title, we're going to be discussing the Sacramento Kings. So let's dive in and let's break down their offseason. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. And without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Sacramento Kings are a little bit weird in my opinion and don't really know their direction. I think they are very comparable to the Bulls in the Eastern Conference for trying to stay middling and trying to win, even though their roster might not be that. And the similar comparisons become even funnier when you dive into the Sacramento Kings roster, as you see that they try basically to reconstruct that Chicago Bulls team. But it makes sense for Sacramento on why they would want to be good. As we all know, the Kings had this very, very long playoff drought where they did not make the playoffs. And it was seemingly the front office's main goal just to bring the fans in to kind of change the atmosphere around in Sacramento. We saw that when they won in the Pacific Division just a couple seasons ago. But ultimately, since they've won that Pacific Division, it ultimately lost to the Golden State Warriors in Series 1 of that playoffs. They haven't really gone much anywhere, right? They next year played the Warriors in that play-in tournament game, won it, but then didn't make the playoffs. Then last year didn't make the playoffs, and then seemingly the year after that didn't make the playoffs. So the Kings have been kind of stuck these last couple of seasons, and when you look at their roster, you can kind of see why in that making sense as we want to dive in and look at who they've added and who they've lost. They haven't really made much change, specifically this season as well, as they've ultimately tried to bolster their roster to be more successful in this Western Conference, where it's seemingly gotten deeper and deeper with the stronger teams getting even stronger this offseason. So without further ado, let's dive in and let's talk about the Kings. So as you guys know, the first thing that we always discuss is the additions for the Sacramento Kings. And for the Kings, they did bring in some new faces. They obviously did lose some others as well. But via trade, they only brought in one new face, and that was Dario Saric, as they acquired him from the Denver Nuggets in a deal, which they sent away Jonas Valanciunas. Now, Valanciunas had been brought into the Kings to complement Sabonis as a backup center, as Sabonis wasn't the greatest at rebounding and defense and would get into seemingly a lot of foul trouble. So having Valanciunas there to be that backup big to hold in those minutes, but also maybe get you some double big minutes with Sabonis playing some power forward, might be able to give you the other leverage here for this side of the Kings. Unfortunately, that didn't work this season, and then they went and made that move, bringing in Dario Saric, trading away Jonas Valanciunas, which had his little debacle, which we'll get into when we discuss him later on. Now, they also did make some signings, bringing in three players here: Isaiah Stevens, Dennis Schroeder, and Drew Eubanks. Isaiah Stevens was a forward who was competing and playing with the Miami Heat in that wing rotation, with that clogged wing room being there with guys like Jaime Jaquez, Nikola Jovic, Haywood Highsmith, stuff like that. Stevens never really got to blossom there, so he goes over to Sacramento to find a spot there. Drew Eubanks played with the Utah Jazz and the Phoenix Suns the back-to-back seasons before ultimately being traded to the Los Angeles Clippers to go be a backup big with the Clippers, making their much-needed added adjustments to put them into the top conversations. Drew Eubanks seemingly fell out of their rotation, fell out of their roster, and Sacramento picks him up for some depth here. And then the big signing for Sacramento was Dennis Schroeder. A little bit of a questionable one, as Schroeder, even at the Euro League, proved this year that he is one of the more dominant EuroLeague players and still a starting level caliber point guard in the NBA. He does seemingly really hold a reservation spot because of the fact that I ultimately don't necessarily know if he really heightens or makes the game a lot better for his teammates or is going to really, grow into that star player for them, right? We all know that he is a little bit more of a veteran at this point, and I think now for Dennis Schroeder being that, fourth, fifth star on a team could be really good. But for Sacramento, once again, a team that does have the star power on roster-wise, but with the meshing of it, doesn't really make sense for me. And Dennis Schroeder, I think, is going to come in and be a solid game changer to lead this offense. As Domantas Sabonis says that they need an initiator after trading away De'Aaron Fox, and now obviously trading away Tyrese Haliburton a couple seasons ago. They do need an actual true point guard, so Schroeder will come in and be able to replicate that for this team. But once again, I think Sacramento is trying to put all these pieces together that, even if they do look good on paper, might not mesh well together, or even if so, are just not enough to take some of these top teams in the Western Conference down. And then lastly, they did make some selections in the draft, 2 of them to be exact, Nick Clifford and Maxime Reynaud. They ultimately traded for the Nick Clifford pick from the Oklahoma City Thunder, who had a numerous amount of first-round selections. Nick Clifford was someone that I thought was a solid selection for the Kings because they desperately need wing defense and wing defenders. If you look at this team clearly from the depth chart, before we even break into it, you can see that they only have 2 wings realistically on this roster, and Clifford is one of them. They just drafted him. Besides that, DeMar DeRozan, Keegan Murray, those are the only really 2 other wings on this team that should be at least getting playing time, or should be competing to get playing time on this roster, in my opinion. So drafting a young forward that hopefully can bring that edge on the defensive end as a catch-and-shoot scorer as well will be very nice. And then Maxime Reynaud, obviously coming from Stanford, one of the better shooting bigs in this draft class, standing in at 7 feet, hopefully could come in and be a sniper for this Kings team to help them out with some spacing and scoring, because the Kings are notoriously known for being a top 3-point shooting team, and when they are a top 3-point shooting team, they are very successful. Their year where they won the Pacific, number 3 in the Western Conference, they were one of the best 3-point shooting teams across the NBA. And when they've struggled with their 3-point shooting, it's been clearly resemblant in their offensive output and how their stars have not been able to really replicate the amount of offensive efficiency that they had been that previous season, where they were one of the highest scoring teams across the NBA. So Reynaud hopefully is going to be able to come in and be able to help out that. He did play against some weaker competition, so there will be an eye on him, but ultimately I do think with this center room, he could maybe blossom and find himself into this rotation. And then looking at those 2-way guys, Isaiah Stevens, one of them was signed by the Sacramento Kings from the Miami Heat. He is going to be over on a 2-way alongside Dylan Caldwell and Daquan Plowden. So now let's go over who the Sacramento Kings lost. And like we talked about with Dario Saric, they ultimately lost Jonas Valanciunas, trading him to the Denver Nuggets, hopefully bolstering that front court for Nikola Jokic. For the Kings, once again, Valanciunas wasn't really helping them out last season, was more of a net negative for the Kings. And then secondly, as we all know, he wanted to go to Europe. He wanted to go to Panathinaikos. He wanted to go play overseas. And the Nuggets, because they acquired him and he was still under contract for 1 more year, were not going to allow that to happen because they wanted to keep him. But maybe this was something that the Kings desperately did know about Valanciunas and said, hey, we don't want to lose him for absolutely nothing. We signed him to a 2-year deal last year. Now he wants to leave. And with the Kings, we all know how the Kings can really mismanage things. They probably would have just let him walk, or would have found a way to ultimately just been like, yeah, it's okay, we'll let you do it. So for them to kind of escape that and giving him to the Denver Nuggets, that was a little bit beneficial for them. They also lost 2 players from this team in free agency, Jake LaRavia and Isaiah Crawford. Crawford signed a 2-way with the Rockets, looking to find some growth in that rotation. And LaRavia was one of their wing defenders for the Sacramento Kings team, someone that maybe Nick Clifford is going to replace, but brought in from the Memphis Grizzlies, who had a logjam of wings in their rotation. LaRavia kind of came into Sacramento and actually looked pretty solid because, once again, he did what they needed. They didn't have this combo wing defender that, didn't need the ball in his hands to score and was just going to be someone that was just going to help on the defensive end, right? The Sacramento Kings team is all out offense, all out scoring, no defense. They need those types of players. LaRavia goes to the Lakers to go play with his good old friend Austin Reeves, and it makes sense still getting to stay in the state of California, going to a brighter, flashier team, getting to play with one of his friends. He ultimately was traded to the Kings at the trade deadline, so it didn't really make sense for him to be a long-term fit for them. Ultimately, they lose him in free agency. I would have liked him to stay with their team because I think he would have benefited them stuff and given some more depth in that wing department with Nick Clifford and DeMar DeRozan, maybe even giving them some leeway, to trade DeMar DeRozan. But ultimately, they do not, and Jake LaRavia does leave the Sacramento Kings. And then we get into the unsigned free agents and the overseas players for the Kings here. So with the Sacramento Kings, they ultimately did lose a lot of players on their team that they did have, and some of them just haven't been able to bounce back or find a new spot. One of them being Jay Crowder, who is a veteran for the Sacramento Kings team. Once again, kind of a depth piece on the edges, someone that they could sign for cheap to be that defensive wing, but with his age kind of getting up there, Jay Crowder is more just a filler piece across the league in my eyes, and unfortunately is probably not going to be bouncing back to the Kings, or maybe not bouncing back to the NBA. We'll have to keep an eye on him. Markelle Fultz, who was signed late into this season with the Sacramento Kings, as he was dealing with an injury after having a little bit of a bounce back season with the Magic. The previous year, he wound up in Sacramento to help out their point guard room, obviously with not having a key distributor. Trading away De'Aaron Fox, they needed someone else to kind of help out distribution and being that guy to set up the offense, so Fultz was brought in. Unfortunately for Fultz, he is not going to be sticking long in Sacramento, as he once again was not re-signed and still remains a free agent out there alongside Jay Crowder. And then lastly, for the Sacramento Kings, Terrence Davis, the latest victim for the Sacramento Kings, as he was just recently waived with his non-guaranteed deal. Still having that deadline, the Kings ultimately move off of him. Someone who played a shooting guard, small forward kind of combo role for the Kings, was trying to compete into that rotation, had some bright moments, but never necessarily benefited himself to stand out in this rotation, and that's why he finds himself still a free agent. Could still get picked up though, because he was recently just waived, so going into training camp, maybe some teams are keeping an eye on him, following some more waivings or for a potential G League signing, but that's where it goes for Terrence Davis. And then lastly, two players that are on this team that have now signed overseas are Mason Jones and Trey Lyles. Mason Jones was on a two-way with the Sacramento Kings last year. He is now signed with the NBL, going over and playing for the Perth Wildcats, while Trey Lyles, someone who was drafted in the lottery, someone who was respected to be a good college and high school athlete, and was going to be someone that was viewed as a consistent role player around the NBA as a shooting four, has officially gone overseas to Real Madrid. And ultimately, I was a little bit shocked by this news. I feel like Lyles could still stand in the NBA. He has a very similar play style to guys like, Georges Niang, Larry Nance Jr. Those guys are still kind of, in the NBA at this point. I felt like a guy like Trey Lyles also could kind of stand his chances with some of those names. But unfortunately for Lyles, maybe with him being a free agent and with, the new CBA and how everything is restrictive, maybe teams really just necessarily didn't see a benefactor for adding Trey Lyles to their roster as some additional shooting, and then rather invest into those, younger buyer products into that shooting department. So for Lyles, he goes over to Real Madrid. Wouldn't be shocked if he somehow, maybe halfway through the season, similar to a guy like Lonnie Walker who came back to the NBA, or even like a guy like Gershon Yabusele or Nigel Hayes-Davis, gets an opportunity to come back in a season or two, because Lyles is a very effective NBA role player, and I ultimately think that once the teams kind of understand this new CBA and can kind of get these players on contracts that kind of match how it is going to dictate the understanding of the percentages of contracts, I do think he could find himself back into the NBA. Now, let's dive into the depth chart and then give my prediction. So looking at this depth chart for the Kings, it's a little wonky, as you guys can see. They have four centers. And yeah, we'll start there. Four centers. I mean, Sabonis being their best player, arguably probably the one that could be on the trade block by the end of the season with his growing frustrations in Sacramento. I would not be shocked. But with Sacramento still wanting to compete, who knows if they trade Sabonis for a young package? Maybe they flip him for another player like they did Zach LaVine for De'Aaron Fox. I don't necessarily know. But for Domantas Sabonis, he's clearly a great offensive guy, can grab a lot of rebounds, can be an effective piece down low for the Sacramento Kings team. I just have his qualities on the defensive end being a huge struggle, and with the Sacramento Kings not really having a defensive anchor to play alongside of him in this front court, it does weary me. Isaac Jones is a nice young piece that I know a lot of Sacramento Kings fans want to see kind of rise in this rotation alongside Maxime Renaud, kind of competing Drew Eubanks, once again, I feel like is kind of just some insurance, some injury preservation to kind of help out there for the Sacramento Kings, but maybe he gets a role within this rotation. You could arguably put Sarge as a center in this team as two, but ultimately I see him playing more back into that power forward role that we did see where him on the 76ers early on in his career, because they still need depth there with that shooting variability with guys like Keegan Murray, Dario Saric, and Doug McDermott. Once again, the Kings bring back McDermott on a contract, and similar to Drew Eubanks, I feel like he is kind of just some fodder for them, just injury preservation, someone to have in this depth chart to kind of just hold over. And once again, since the Kings want to win, they want to be competitive, they're signing guys like Doug McDermott and Drew Eubanks instead of younger players that maybe could help them blossom or be really stand out to find a role on the Sacramento Kings. Keegan Murray, once again, playing this power forward. Many Sacramento Kings fans recognize this is not his true position. They should have a defensive anchor power forward alongside Sabonis and move him into that small forward position, trying to move off of a guy either in Zach LaVine or DeMar DeRozan, as obviously their contracts are very big and they don't really fit this team. But ultimately, the Sacramento Kings are not going to do that, and we're going to have to watch this kind of unfold in front of us. But once again, now that gets into the small forward discussions with DeMar DeRozan, who, me personally, I thought was going to be a great fit for the Sacramento Kings. I was completely wrong. I will admit that. The ISO ball fitting alongside De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis was just not going to work. And now with Zach LaVine, we're basically just with the Chicago Bulls 2.0, with them being in the Western Conference now, which is stronger than the East, and replacing Nikola Vucevic with Domantas Sabonis and some better veteran players. Yes, the team ultimately is going to be better than that Chicago Bulls team, but how much better, I don't necessarily know, because Sabonis, once again, is very similar to Nikola Vucevic, in which they're very great offensive players, need the ball in their hands to score down low, can still rebound, but have their defensive efficiencies. And without having that defensive anchor either in the front court behind them or playing alongside of them, it is just going to not benefit this Sacramento Kings team. So with coming into DeMar DeRozan, I think that this makes sense for them to look to trade him. It is the last year of his deal. I don't care that you traded for him last year. The fit is not working. Even if you get dollars, basically get pennies on the dollar, move off of DeMar DeRozan and at least try to invest into something and try to get a piece that can benefit you, right? There are teams that are going to be interested in DeMar DeRozan once we get closer to the trade deadline, because in that Eastern Conference, they are going to be a lot closer. And I ultimately do think that's when we'll see something happen. Zach LaVine, I would say the same, but he doesn't really have a tradable contract, with that contract just ascending. So I think Sacramento is stuck with him. They've tried to move Malik Monk. They've tried to move Devin Carter. Once again, they were very interested in the Jonathan Kuminga situation. And maybe that's where DeMar DeRozan comes into play, coming at the trade deadline as a third team, using his contract to bring in Jonathan Kuminga. I don't know what's going to happen with that whole situation. With him signing with the Warriors, it looks dead as of now. With the Kings, being the Kings, we could always see something happening at the trade deadline or even next year. But once again, Monk, solid three-point scorer. Really like him, but with his contract ascending, and ultimately with him being a player that is a very good six-man, still has some defensive liabilities. With him being a starter / six-man, I think his contract in the new CBA looks a little wonky, even if he's a good player, to where teams are fearful to trade for him. Hopefully, Nick Clifford can bounce into this starting small forward, and then Devin Carter can hopefully either get traded or find an opportunity to grow within this rotation with a guy like Malik Monk or DeMar DeRozan leaving, and then going into the point guard situation. Dennis Schroeder going to be that lead initiator, someone that I think is going to be solid for the Kings, but ultimately not necessarily is going to take them over the top. And then Keon Ellis, very, very, very foolish move for the Kings not to negotiate with Keon Ellis to try to extend him. I don't know what they're doing. They may lose him in free agency. One of their better defenders on this team, and really one of their only defenders in this guard rotation, alongside Devin Carter and Dennis Schroeder. I think he's going to excel. I think some team's going to value that, and I think they're going to lose him going into next season, which is just a Kings thing to happen. So with that being said, we're getting into this video a little too farther than I'd like. So the Kings coming at 13th. Once again, the Jazz, I just think, are a mess. They only have really Lauri Markkanen. It's a bunch of young guys that make sense. The Pelicans just have a lot of injury history, even though they might have some guys similar to the Kings who look like they could make this roster a little bit better. I just don't know if these teams mesh well. And with the Kings, it's just a lot of star power on paper. But Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, Domantas Sabonis, we've seen this work before in the past with Dennis Schroeder. It's not going to work in Sacramento. and I ultimately do think that the Kings are going to be towards the bottom with one of the worst defenses across the NBA. Yes, they might have a level offense where they can put up points and might even win some games because of the fact that they can outscore their opponents. But on the defensive end, man, if they go up against a really good two-way team, they're going to be cooked with them getting just absolutely torched on that side of the ball. So let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section. Ultimately, the Kings, I think, are stuck in no man's land at the moment. They need to reset their roster. Unfortunately, Levine's not a tradable contract, but move off Sabonis, move off DeMar DeRozan, really try to move off Malik Monk, and really reshuffle this core, maybe in a 2, 3, 4 year gap to kind of get back into the situation that you just were a couple of seasons ago, but with a young, exciting team trying to make the playoffs so that your fans can actually buy into the product. But once again, thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. Like I said, we'll have these videos coming out daily now, twice a day because we're getting closer to the season. So if you want to stay up to date, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.